Okay, so indie games. I think at this point we all know that these small games made by small development teams are doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to the gaming industry, where it feels like in its current state, many AAA games are homogenized and bloated. Indies serve as a breath of fresh air and scratch an itch that bigger budget games aren't able to, delivering small but impactful experiences. So let's explore why indies are matching and even surpassing some of the big budget AAA games and why they're so important to the gaming ecosystem. First, let's quickly clarify what an indie game actually is. Indie stems from the word independent, but it's really taken on its own meaning, and now not all independent games are indie. Independent means self-published, but that covers such a broad spectrum of games, from games like Baldur's Gate 3 all the way down to games like Undertale. Nowadays, the term indie relates more to the scope of a game rather than its independent status, classified more by being made by an individual or a small team with a limited budget and resources. Indie games with publishers are getting more and more common, with publishers that almost exclusively publish indie games, Devolver Digital being a mainstay, and emerging publishers like Donkey's Big Mode. They provide a place for these games to exist, as well as much needed exposure to generate intrigue and interest. I think whether a game is indie or not really comes down to common sense. Obviously, Cyberpunk 2077 isn't an indie game despite being independent. Every now and then we'll get a game that kind of blurs the line between is it indie or not, but for the most part we can all recognize indie game energy when we play one. So where do indies sit in the landscape of gaming? Well, gaming is so broad that there really is a space for both larger and smaller games to exist, as long as their value aligns with their price point. There's obviously a huge demand for these smaller indie games given their popularity, but whether it's a AAA game or an indie game, we just want to play great games. The surface level answer as to why these indie games are outperforming larger AAA games is simply because they're better games. But what does better actually mean? AAA and indie games are fundamentally different and are on opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to game design mindset, the restrictions they face, and the scope of their game. And these differences are the reasons why I think so many of us gravitate towards indie games. So let's compare the two.
Round 1. Fight!
Now I'm about to wail on AAA games for a bit, but just know this doesn't encompass all AAA games. These are just trends that I've observed and pain points that I think need addressing to demonstrate the stark difference between indie games and AAA games. Now, of course, there will always be a place for big budget AAA games. They're not going anywhere, and there's no denying the amazing games that have been released each year. 2023 was stacked with banger after banger, but lately there's been a hole that they haven't been able to completely fill. In a day and age of remakes and sequels, truly new IP seems to be few and far between when compared to older generations. A lot of game studios and publishers don't want to or can't take the right risks when it comes to game development. And what I mean by right risks are risks that are in service of the game. Things like innovation, experimentation, and the willingness to try new things to push the boundaries of gaming. Walking a tightrope between creative risks and profit is much scarier if you're 1,000 meters in the air, by which I mean you have a lot more to lose if it doesn't work out. I think a lot of these games have become far too big for their own good. These games have extremely large budgets and long development times, and are often crushed under their own weight of ambition and scope. And each game that doesn't meet sales expectations is another regression back into the safe, comfortable shell of familiar IP and past successes, stifling innovation and experimentation within the AAA landscape. Concord was an attempt at a new IP, but was a colossal failure for a multitude of reasons. But I worry that it only perpetuates the incorrect notion that gamers don't want new IP. Sony and other publishers may take away the wrong lessons from Concord and attribute the millions of dollars lost to be because it was a new IP. We all know that these publishers aren't good at heeding warnings, even when the writing's on the wall. From a business perspective, taking a risk on a brand new IP is just too high considering these games and their enormous budgets. The potential loss is just too great. The funny thing is, not taking a risk is a risk in and of itself, and often ends up being more detrimental than if they had taken a risk in the first place. Because what's worse than a bad game? A boring game. As well as playing it safe, I feel like there's been an emerging trend as of late where games seem to be getting dumbed down, being made to be more casual and streamlined in order to appeal to a wider demographic. We all know the saying at this point, a game made for everyone is a game made for idiots. I mean, just look at this brain-dead puzzle from Dragon Age the Veilguard that SkillUp showcased in his review. And there's lots of other examples I can think of, but maybe that's a video for another day. On top of all of this, I find AAA games often focus on the wrong things, putting aesthetics above function and often dedicating too much time and money to superficial aspects of a game like hair physics or being able to see each individual pore on someone's nose. Realism and graphical fidelity are very low on my priority lists when it comes to a good game. Like for example, Red Dead Redemption 2. I prefer much more if the resources that went into making realistic horseball physics went into evolving the combat that they had taken from Red Dead Redemption 1. And I know game development isn't that simple, but honestly, some poor dev had to program horseballs to grow or shrink depending on the climate and weather conditions. Imagine being involved in the creation of Red Dead Redemption 2 and your mum asks you what you did in the game.
Horseballs.
What was that?
I make it horseballs.
I didn't hear you. I programmed horseballs to shrink and grow in weather conditions. Anyway, this video is about indies, so why am I just dogging on AAA games? Well, this helps set the stage for indie games because all of these criticisms are almost non-existent in the indie game space.
Round 2. Fight!
Compared to AAA games, indie games are almost the exact opposite. Indie developers for the most part don't have existing established IP to piggyback off. They're starting from square one and have to make a compelling first impression. They don't have the notoriety of larger game studios and are essentially nobodies until they prove themselves with their game. And it may sound harsh, but that's just the nature of the gaming industry. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. For every successful indie game, there are many failed ones that we never end up hearing about. And it's really a trial by fire, but the ones that emerge on the other side are glorious. I think to succeed it requires a great gameplay loop, good business sense, and a lot of luck. Take Among Us for example, which had a unique premise but wouldn't be recognized until 2 years after its release when a streamer would start playing it and send it to the stratosphere during COVID lockdowns. Unlike AAA developers, indie developers are not only forced to take the right risks, but inspired and excited to. They want to push themselves creatively and leave their mark on the gaming industry by innovating and experimenting, nurturing their ideas into playable games. Now to be clear, I'm sure most game developers feel this way, but the nature of large studios doesn't grant the flexibility to creatively express yourself as much as a small indie studio can. And the great thing about this is that the game always comes first. Many AAA games have become compromised in an attempt to appeal to as many people as possible. Indie games aren't able to and don't want to appeal to everyone. I suspect that for indie developers, their game appeal is an afterthought because putting game appeal first flies in the face of good design. It's trying to make a square-shaped game so it can fit into a square-shaped hole, versus making a game the shape that fits the creative vision, which naturally creates its own place to sit. If the game has a good gameplay loop, it'll find its own audience. And sure, it might be more niche and appeal to a smaller audience, but that audience will be dedicated and passionate about that specific game genre. Provided that the game is decent, they'll advocate for it and bolster it through word of mouth. Attempting to appeal to everyone means that you'll appeal to no one, and the idea of appealing to everyone is purely profit-driven and almost never makes a game better. And I can almost guarantee that an indie developer making, say, a roguelike loves and plays roguelikes, knows them inside out, and has their own ideas for spins that they could put on the genre. And it's these interesting spins on existing genres that make indie games so important to the gaming ecosystem. They take what makes a great game and boil it down to its most essential points, making it even more evident what truly matters when it comes to a great game. Gameplay. All you need is an addictive gameplay loop. If we strip away all these superficial cosmetic elements of a game and trim the fat down to its very core, it's always gameplay at the very center. Which sounds obvious when you say it. I mean, games are made to be played, but it feels like a lot of these larger game studios have lost sight of this. For indie games, first and foremost is fun. Take a game like Downwell for example. It has an extremely simple premise where you need to get as far down a well as you can. We've seen this kind of game before, but Downwell adds a twist where you have guns for feet, and every time you shoot, you kill enemies below you as well as slow your momentum so you don't fall too fast. It has a combo system and roguelite elements offering randomized upgrades as you pass through each level. It may not hold your attention for hours on end, but it executes what it's trying to do very well by having a simple but interesting gameplay loop that keeps me wanting to come back for another run when I have a spare 5 minutes here and there. It's not trying to overwhelm me with unnecessary fluff or extreme graphical fidelity, it just wants me to have fun and get as far down the well as I can. The restrictions indie games have on budget and resources pushes innovation and encourages thinking outside the box. Indie developers need to differentiate their game among a sea of similar games, and it could be something as simple as having guns for feet. It could be an intriguing world with simple controls that encourage creative thinking and experimentation. It could be an easy to learn but hard to master gameplay loop, or it could be the combination of poker with the roguelike genre. What I find funny is that the restrictions indie studios have help to cultivate innovation, whereas the self-imposed restrictions of AAA studios often stifle it. Indie games are full to the brim with creative and interesting ideas, and it's a testament to these developers' creativity and their ability to execute on it. I think what makes great innovation is when you see something and you say, of course, it's so simple, why hasn't someone done this before? This gameplay first mentality is the foundation of most indies and is a big reason why so many of us love and respect these games and their creators. There's also more of a personal element to indie developers and their games. When I know a game is being made by one individual or a small team, I feel more inclined to support them and their game, hoping for their success. It feels more relatable knowing that there's a person just like you and I on the grind doing everything they can to make a great game. And while having a small team does have its limits and may seem like a restriction, it does have its advantages. A small team is much easier to manage when it comes to assigning workloads, making decisive creative decisions, and actioning changes. There aren't too many chefs in the kitchen. The chain of command is singular and smaller in scope compared to its larger counterparts. Larger companies have an organizational structure and multiple teams, which makes communication much more difficult, and getting approvals for things can take much longer because it has to run through multiple departments and managers. Whenever I see an indie game blowing up, I have this image of executives outraged in a conference room trying to figure out the enigma of the indie game, trying to understand how an indie game with a fraction of the budget of their own game did so well, like they just can't comprehend how it was done.
I don't understand. We shoehorned in all the gameplay systems. We added a battle pass, just like the kids wanted. How is their game surpassed ours in sales?
It's like they can't see what's obviously sitting in front of their faces.
Round 3. Fight!
In a world where your average game is 60 to 70 freedom dollars or 100 to 120 dollary dues in Australia in my case, indies are our saviors and are relieving the financial burden on our wallets, often being a fraction of the price of a AAA game. With every type of game, whether it's an indie, a AA, a AAA, or a quadruple A, there's a degree of expectation each one has depending on its price point. Value is a subjective metric we assign to games once we've experienced them. But there are obvious objective truths to value, like the higher the game price is, the more we expect from it. And conversely, when a game is cheaper, our expectations are lower in terms of scope, length, and quality. But I would say price to game value isn't a linear scale, and there's way more potential value in cheaper games. If we compare the price of one AAA game to the numerous indie games you could buy with the same amount of money, it becomes obvious. $60 is a lot, and if I'm going to be forking out that kind of money, the game better be firing on all cylinders. Price is a huge contributing factor to the backlash that bad AAA games receive because the price to value expectation ratio isn't being satisfied. I'm much more willing to pay $5 for a game knowing that it might not be for me, and even more willing with things like Game Pass and the PlayStation Plus catalog that let you try these games out without buying them, essentially only paying with the time that I dedicate to trying them out. For example, I heard great things about Dave the Diver, so I picked it up and realized that it wasn't for me. And that's fine, I didn't have to sink $60 into it only to realize that I didn't like it and it wasn't for me. Unlike say Diablo 4, which I purchased when it released but quickly realized that I just wasn't vibing with it. But it was too late to get my $109.95 back. Yeah, that one stung. Definitely take advantage of Steam's refund policy if you can. Replayability is another reason why I think as the price of a game goes down, the value potential goes up. Genres like the roguelike genre go hand in hand with indie games. They have the addictive gameplay loop of wanting to get just a little bit further, the unpredictability of power-ups and builds, and the comforting idea that one run isn't going to take up your whole day. Although I have fallen victim to the just one more run trap more than I'd care to admit, but that's just evidence of a good game. Roguelikes have almost infinite replayability, and it's up to the player to decide how far they want to go with it, allowing them to push the games to its limits if they want to. For example, Slay the Spire, a deck-building roguelike, is one of my favorites. It hooked me from the get-go with its variety of characters that all play differently, with its addictive gameplay loop and its unpredictable and powerful builds that can make every run feel unique and like you're breaking the game in different ways. These games are so much fun when they don't impose restrictions on the player and let you become insanely powerful. When I boot up Slay the Spire, I feel no pressure. I know a good run will last me 30 minutes to an hour, which is sometimes all I can afford. Sure, it's not much of a looker, but it hasn't stopped me from putting hours into the game. If you haven't played Slay the Spire and are a fan of deck builders and or roguelikes, then I would highly recommend it. Depending on where you're at in your life, some would say their time is more valuable than their money, and as we get older, the age demographic for gaming only widens. A lot of us don't have time for games like we used to when we were younger. We had to be adults and pay bills and work 9 to 5 and take care of kids. In a world where AAA games feel bloated and monotonous, trying to consume as much time as possible, short but compact experiences are a breath of fresh air. Honestly, as someone in their 30s with many time-consuming responsibilities, I find it daunting when a massive 100+ hour game releases, especially one I'm likely to enjoy and be interested in. I love Final Fantasy, but I still haven't been able to commit myself to starting Final Fantasy VII Rebirth because I know how long it's going to take me to complete, given my limited time to play games. On top of that, I feel a sense of pressure to continue playing these games until I finish them, because if I don't, I risk putting it on my shameful pile of unfinished games, which only seems to be getting bigger and bigger. I don't finish as much games as I used to, and if I stop, I find it really hard to return to them, because when I do, I barely remember what's going on and I've forgotten how to play the game, essentially having to start from scratch again. It's like when season 2 of a show comes out years later after season 1 and you have no idea what's going on. It also seems like a lot of AAA games have tried to fool us into thinking that a longer game equals more value, leading to bloat and padding for the sake of padding. I would much rather have a laser-focused smaller game that doesn't overstay its welcome than a larger game with anime filler fetch quests and laborious footwork side objectives like collectibles that seem to plague so many games today. Sometimes it feels like game developers have a game length quota that they're required to meet before their game ships, and it ends up being quantity over quality. There's something comforting about knowing that a game you're about to play is digestible and can be completed within a short amount of time. Games are like food. We don't just want to eat the same thing every day. We want some variety. Sometimes we're starving and crave an expensive 3-course meal. Sometimes we just want some comfort food, and other times we just want a small sweet treat. A few short-lived bites bursting with flavor. And to take this analogy even further, these indie games serve as great palate cleansers after completing, say, a 100+ hour RPG. With the long development times of these bigger games, indies are the perfect in-between games that can hold us over until the next big anticipated release. And sometimes you just want to turn your brain off and jump down a well with guns for feet.
Final round.
So those are my observations of indie games from a consumer perspective, but there's also another vital importance of indie games that we don't see directly, and that is the cultivation and fostering of new game development talent. With the mass layoffs that have happened in the gaming industry and many leaving on their own accord to pursue more profitable careers in semi-related industries, which I don't blame them for, there is no doubt that talent has been lost. But in this grim reality, indie developers are a beacon of hope, providing an avenue for fresh potential talent and a place for a creative outlet of new ideas. And the amazing part is, anyone can make games now if you put your mind to it. Access to the industry has never been easier with tools like Unreal 5 and Godot, coupled with YouTube where you can learn almost anything for free. It means young developers have the tools they need to follow their passion, hone their skills, and increase the overall talent pool in the industry. Basically, more talent equals better games for us. Not only do indies help siphon more talent into the gaming industry, it also encourages devs to innovate and experiment with their ideas. True innovation in gaming is extremely rare, especially as time goes on. It's not often that you get things like FromSoft and Souls-likes. Their innovations gave birth to an entire new genre. Almost every game has ideated off one or more of their predecessors, which is great, but indies are able to go so much further with their ideas, taking risks that AAA developers don't have the opportunity to take. And these innovations create feedback loops where other devs start to experiment and expand on these newly established ideas. I really tip my hat to anyone that's involved in game development and am extremely grateful to them, so if there's any devs watching, thank you so much and keep crushing it. And you may think that this doesn't really affect us, but it already has with the ever-growing list of bad games that have released in recent memory. A game's quality has many contributing factors, but you can't make a good game without talented developers. And I wouldn't say something as grandiose as indie games have saved gaming, but I would say that they've helped the gaming ecosystem by bringing in and keeping more innovative and passionate game developers in the industry. Ultimately, it all leads back to one thing: a larger talent pool and a healthier gaming industry means the continued release of amazing games to play for the foreseeable future. And from a consumer's perspective, that's all it really comes down to at the end of the day. So let me know in the comments what your most underrated indie game is, and maybe give someone else's most underrated game a try as well. And if you say that there are no good games coming out and that gaming's dead and it's not what it used to be, then you really need to get off Call of Duty and expand your horizons a little bit and take a chance on an indie game. You won't regret it, and if you do, don't worry, it won't cost you much time or money. Alright, bye now.